Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we dive into the most decisive moment in James and Diep's journey so far. After months of silent struggle and careful planning, James finally confronts the man who has controlled his life from the shadows, his own father, Mr. Hoan. With undeniable evidence in his hands, James is forced to make a choice that will either destroy his family or secure the future he wants with Diep. This isn't just a battle of power, but a test of courage, love, and self-respect. Stay with us until the end to see how this risky decision leads to an unexpected turning point for James and Diep. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every thought feel heavier. James sat alone in a dimly lit room, a folder resting on the table in front of him. Inside that folder was everything. Months of patience, sleepless nights, and risks he never imagined he'd take against his own blood. The evidence was complete now. Financial records, recorded conversations, signed documents, witness statements. Every piece pointed to one undeniable truth. His father, Mr. Hoan, was guilty. James stared at the folder for a long time without opening it. His hands didn't shake anymore. That fear had already passed. What remained was a dull ache, settled deep in his chest. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice in the way people like to talk about it. For James, this was about protecting the woman he loved and ending a shadow that had loomed over his life for far too long. He thought of Diep, her quiet determination, the way she always tried to solve problems on her own so she wouldn't burden anyone. The countless times she'd been targeted, pressured, and hurt simply because she stood beside him. James clenched his jaw. He had promised himself, no matter the cost, he wouldn't let that happen again. A soft knock broke the silence. James stood, straightened his jacket, and took a slow breath before opening the door. Mr. Hoan stepped inside, his expression unreadable, sharp eyes quickly scanning the room. He looked calm, confident even, as if he already knew he was in control. "You wanted to see me?" Mr. Hoan asked, his tone flat. "Yes," James replied. "We need to talk." They sat across from each other, father and son separated by a narrow table that suddenly felt like an unbridgeable distance. For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking of a wall clock filled the space, counting seconds that felt unbearably loud. Mr. Hoan broke the silence first. "If this is about Diep again, I've already made my position clear." James nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I asked you here." He slid the folder forward, stopping it exactly in the middle of the table. Mr. Hoan's eyes flickered down to it, then back up. "What is this?" "Everything," James said calmly. "Every illegal transaction, every forged contract, every order you gave behind closed doors." The air shifted. Mr. Hoan leaned back slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. "You think threatening me with paperwork will change my mind?" James didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you a choice." That caught Mr. Hoan's attention. James continued, his words steady but heavy with meaning. "If you continue to oppose my marriage to Diep, I will hand this evidence over to the police. every page, every recording. I won't interfere with the investigation. I won't protect you." Silence slammed into the room. For the first time, Mr. Hahn's confidence wavered. Not much, just enough for James to notice. His father reached for the folder, opened it, and flipped through several pages. The deeper he went, the tighter his jaw became. "You would destroy your own father?" Mr. Hwan asked quietly. James met his gaze without flinching. "You destroyed this family long before I ever thought about doing that." The words hung between them, sharp and irreversible. "I stayed silent for years," James went on. "I watched you control my life, my choices, even the person I love. I convinced myself that blood meant obligation, that silence meant loyalty, but I was wrong." Mr. Hwan closed the folder slowly. "And Diep convinced you of this?" "No," James said immediately. "She never asked me to do any of this. This is my decision." That answer seemed to anger Mr. Hwan more than anything else. "You're willing to throw everything away for a woman," he snapped. James stood up. "I'm willing to stand up for myself for the first time." His voice didn't shake, but the pain behind it was unmistakable. "I won't deny what I found," James continued. "I won't pretend I didn't see it. And I won't allow you to hurt Diep again, directly or indirectly. This ends now." Mr. Hwan rose as well, his expression darkening. "You think the police will protect you? You think the world is that simple?" "I don't care," James replied. "I've already accepted the consequences." The room felt smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Mr. Hwan studied his son for a long time. This wasn't the hesitant boy who used to lower his eyes. This was a man who had made a decision and wasn't backing down. "You've changed," Mr. Hwan said quietly. "Yes," James answered, "because I had to." Another stretch of silence followed. This time, it wasn't filled with tension alone, but something closer to resignation. Finally, Mr. Hwan sighed. The sound carried years of pride, control, and unspoken regret. "If I agree," he said slowly, "you'll destroy the evidence?" "I won't submit it," James corrected. "But I won't erase it either. It stays where it is." A dangerous pause. "And Diep?" Mr. Hwan asked. "She becomes my wife," James said firmly. "With your acceptance. No conditions. No interference." Mr. Hwan looked away, his gaze landing on the window. Outside, the city lights flickered, indifferent to the battle happening inside this room. For the first time, he seemed older, heavier, like a man finally realizing the cost of his own actions. "You've cornered me," he said bitterly. "No," James replied. "You cornered yourself." The truth hit harder than any accusation. Minutes passed. Then finally, Mr. Hwan turned back. His voice was low, restrained. "Fine." James's heart skipped, but he kept his expression steady. "I will accept your marriage to Diep," Mr. Hwan continued. "I won't interfere, and I won't touch her company again." Relief washed through James so suddenly it almost weakened his knees. "But understand this," Mr. Hwan added. "Our relationship ends here." James nodded. "I know." There was no celebration in that moment, no victory. Just a quiet, painful ending to something that had been broken for a long time. As Mr. Hwan walked toward the door, he stopped briefly. "You chose her," he said without turning back. "Yes," James replied, "and I don't regret it." The door closed softly behind him. James remained standing, staring at the space where his father had been. His chest felt tight, but lighter at the same time. The battle was over, but the consequences were just beginning. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over Diep's name. For the first time in a long while, hope didn't feel fragile. It felt real. The city was still wrapped in early morning haze when James finally stepped out of the building. The sky was pale gray, and the streets were unusually quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He paused at the entrance, letting the cool air brush against his face. Only then did the weight of everything that had happened truly begin to sink in. There was no feeling of victory, no sense of triumph. What lingered instead was exhaustion, deep, bone-level exhaustion, mixed with a fragile calm he hadn't felt in years. For so long, his life had revolved around anticipation and fear. Fear of his father's power, fear of what might happen to Diep, fear of what would be taken from him next. Now, for the first time, those fears were quiet. James pulled out his phone. He stared at the screen for a few seconds before tapping Diep's name. She answered quickly, her voice still carrying traces of sleep. "James, is everything okay? I need to see you," he said softly. "As soon as possible." Her tone sharpened instantly. "Where are you?" "Near your office. I'll wait." "I'm coming now," she replied without hesitation. They met at a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street. It wasn't fancy, just warm lights, wooden tables, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Diep arrived first, sitting near the window, her hands clasped tightly together. She hadn't slept well. She could tell something had shifted, even before seeing James. When he walked in, she stood up instinctively. He looked different. Tired, yes, but also steadier, as if something heavy had finally been set down. "You're safe?" she asked quietly. James nodded. "I am." They sat across from each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Words felt too small for what hung between them. "I met my father," James finally said. Diep's breath hitched, but she didn't interrupt. "I showed him everything," he continued. "The evidence, every detail." Her eyes widened slightly. "James, that's dangerous." "I know," he said calmly, "but it was necessary." She leaned forward unconsciously. "What happened?" James took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "I told him that if he continued to oppose our marriage, or if he tried to hurt you again in any way, I would hand everything over to the police." Diep stared at him, stunned. "You actually said that?" "Yes." "And?" "He agreed," James said. "He accepted our marriage. No conditions, no interference." For a heartbeat, Diep didn't react. Then her eyes filled with tears she couldn't stop. She covered her mouth, overwhelmed by relief she'd been afraid to hope for. "It's over?" she whispered. "As far as us being stopped?" James replied. "Yes." She shook her head slowly, emotions crashing over her. "You shouldn't have had to do this. Not like that." James reached across the table and took her hand. "I didn't do it just for you, Diep. I did it because I couldn't keep living like that." Her fingers tightened around his. "I was so scared I was holding you back. That loving me meant losing everything." James looked at her, eyes steady, Loving you is the reason I finally stood up." The words broke something open inside her. She leaned forward, resting her forehead lightly against his hand, letting the tension drain away. Over the next hour, James told her everything. He didn't hide the pain. He didn't soften the truth. He told her about the moment his father's confidence cracked, about the silence that followed, about the understanding that whatever relationship they once had was truly gone. "I don't know if I'll ever make peace with that," James admitted, "but I know I couldn't sacrifice you to save it." Diep listened quietly, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I wish I could take some of that pain away." "You already have," he said softly, "just by being here." In the days that followed, the change became undeniable. The pressure around Diep's company vanished almost overnight. Deals that once seemed deliberately blocked suddenly moved forward. Unspoken threats dissolved into nothing. People noticed, but no one asked questions. James kept his distance from his father. There were no calls, no messages beyond a brief confirmation acknowledging the wedding. It hurt, but it was clean. Clear. Final. For Diep, the sense of freedom was almost surreal. For the first time in a long while, she could focus purely on her work, her future, and the life she wanted to build, without constantly looking over her shoulder. One evening, as they walked along a quiet riverside path, Diep finally voiced what she'd been carrying. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what your life would have been like if things had been different?" James considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but if things were different, I might not have found the courage I needed." She smiled faintly. "You're stronger than you think." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "So are you." They stood there for a moment, hands intertwined, the city lights reflecting on the water beside them. For once, the future didn't feel like something to fear. Wedding preparations began quietly. No announcements, no spectacle. Just simple decisions made together. Choosing a date, discussing a small guest list, talking about what truly mattered. "I don't want anything grand," Diep said one night. "I just want peace." James nodded. "That's more valuable than anything." When word of the wedding date reached Mr. Hahn, there was no reaction beyond a short acknowledgement. No congratulations, no objections. It was cold, but it was permission, and that was enough. The night before the wedding, James stood alone on the balcony, looking out at the city that had once felt like a battlefield. Diep joined him, wrapping a light jacket around his shoulders. "Nervous?" she asked gently. "A little," he admitted, "but not afraid." She rested her head against his shoulder. "No matter what happens after tomorrow, thank you for choosing me." James turned and looked at her seriously. "I didn't choose you over my father," he said. "I chose the life I want." Her eyes softened. "And I choose you." The wedding day arrived quietly, without incident. No interruptions, no hidden threats, just familiar faces, warm smiles, and a sense of closure James never thought he'd feel. As Diep walked toward him, James realized something important. The evidence he once clutched like a weapon was no longer the center of his life. It had done its job. It had given him back control. When they stood together, hands joined, James felt a calm certainty settle into his chest. This wasn't rebellion. This was resolution.